Well, thank you everybody for joining us for today's webinar, 2019 Learning Trends, Where We Are and Where We're Headed. So I am, as you might guess, the second person down there on the screen. My name is Stephen Bowler. I'm the Director of Marketing and Business Development here at Bottom Line Performance, and I have the pleasure of introducing my mother, Sharon Bowler.
Hi, everyone. As Steve said, I'm Sharon Bowler, and I'm CEO and President of Bottom Line Performance. And Steve and I have been doing this every year now for the last 4 years. I'm really excited to talk 2019 with you this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world.
So for those that aren't aware, Bottom Line Performance, we're a custom learning design and development company. We have 36 employees and we create custom learning solutions. We also create and manage the Knowledge Guru platform, which is a game-based learning and micro-learning platform as well. So our perspective comes from the world of consulting, from training, design, and development, working with lots of different organizations, mostly Fortune 1000 and larger. And we use that perspective combined with our annual survey to put these trends together for you. So our agenda, we're going to have a little bit of upfront, just trying to set the context of what our perspective is on these trends and how we like to think about them. And then we're really quickly going to share with you just 5 key takeaways, kind of getting to the end before we start at the beginning, so that you can have them in your mind as we go through the data. And then from there, we're going to walk through the survey results, share with you what we saw in the trends data for this year, how it compares to previous years, and also offer some additional analysis and examples where it's relevant. So what's the next big thing? So I think about Samsung when I see this, because I know they use that in their marketing language. And I think that that's very appropriate that they do so, because that's something that a lot of people are concerned about. A lot of people spend a lot of time talking about, analysts, futurists, just regular people like us who are trying to figure out what is that next big trend or technology. And we hear a lot about what we think it's going to be. Or what people think it's going to be. A lot of us are a little nervous about artificial intelligence and about automation, virtual reality, augmented reality. How are they going to change the way that we do things, the way that we create learning experiences? And I think that for many of us, it can start to feel a little exhausting keeping up with the rate of change, keeping up with all of the new trends that we feel like we're supposed to be keeping track of every year. Learning and development professionals, some folks who have been around the industry for several years might even be a little bit jaded with some of these. I know that shortly after smartphones came onto the market, folks were hearing about mobile learning at conferences 10, 11 years ago, about how they were going to reshape the way that we deliver learning. And here we are today in 2019. Mobile certainly has its place in the learning ecosystem as a training delivery method, but it's not the be-all, end-all. There's many cases where it's not the right solution. And I think that it's easy for us to get ahead of ourselves. The reality is that disruptive change takes years, not months. So if we're sitting down and trying to say, how are we going to deliver learning in 2019? Or how are we going to deliver learning in 2020? We really need to be looking at what technologies already exist, what's already been commercialized that we can utilize. Because those things that futurists are excited about are going to take years to develop, years to materialize. What's also true is that for learning and development professionals, if we want to see how people are going to be learning, how we're going to be delivering learning experiences in the next 12 to 24 months, all we really have to do is look at how people are living their lives, what's going on in the consumer space today, what's changed. We can even look at our cousins in the marketing department or folks that are making apps and developing products and see what they're doing. And some of those ideas are oftentimes the things that learning and development is just trying to catch up to. Another point that we like to make is that while technology certainly matters, and we're going to talk a lot about digital technologies, a lot of the biggest breakthroughs in learning and development that we see are more about a shift in methodology than the underlying technology. So that might, in some cases, be just returning to the basics, returning to evidence-based practices and ditching some of the learning myths that are out there. In some cases, it might be augmenting your instructional design practices with some new approaches, or maybe approaches that aren't new, but have been around a while and just haven't been applied to instructional design, such as design thinking, which we're going to talk about a little bit in this session. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage that we're not talking about self-driving cars and fully sentient artificial intelligence on this webinar. We're talking about the things that we can glean from how people are living and working today in their personal lives, how we can help learning and development kind of catch up to that a little bit. So I'm going to let Sharon kind of talk about this strategic time horizons graphic here, because it's a tool that she uses to guide our organization's research and development.
So what Steve is showing you now is a graphic that actually comes from Amy Webb, Dr. Amy Webb, who runs the Future Today Institute and puts out a massive report every year. The 2019 report just came out this week, and it is 300 pages. And she stretches things across this horizon, and we've adapted this model because we like it very well. It works extremely well. So you can see on the far left of it, the tactical side, the stuff that you have a lot of evidence and certainty that it's happening, it's here, and so you need to make tactical plans on how you're going to implement it. Those are the things that are going to be rolling out in the next 12 to 24 months. And then you can see this cone widens as you go, and you get more and more uncertainty. So if I were to put something on the wider end of the spectrum, I would still put artificial intelligence out there. It's system level disruption. I think it'll completely change how things are done. We are seeing limited use cases for it now in the HR space. You're certainly seeing it being used to automate the recruiting process to some degree. People have Alexa in their homes or Google in their homes, and that is run off of artificial intelligence. But systemic wide use of it in the L&D space is probably still years away. Steve pointed to mobile learning, and I first started monitoring mobile learning in the space in around 2007, 2008. And to his point, we're now 10 years later, and you are seeing targeted uses of it, and really it's morphed into something that is more what I would consider responsive use of apps that allow you to view across a variety of devices rather than being mobile specific. So this is a great framework for you to adopt for yourselves internally and to start kind of think about where are these technologies for you. We're going to kind of try and talk about them in the frame of where we see them in the industry. And we have mostly focused on those things that are tactical or strategic right now. So anywhere from the next 12 months or now to the next 5 years. So that hopefully gives you a little bit of context. So toward that end, we're going to start with our 5 key takeaways, and we're going to summarize these here, and then we're going to dive deeper into the data. So the first one, and this comes out of our report, is that time available for training is increasingly perceived as limited. We have to think about the learner journey to avoid wasting it. And I'll talk a little bit later on about that perception versus reality. But the key point is that we have to be more thoughtful about what it takes for people to get from noticing a need to actually sustain performance in the workplace, which brings me right into the second key point, that the learner experience matters more now than it ever has. People expect what they can have in their non-work environment as much in the work environment as well. So when I can get a personalized experience on Netflix, why can't I get a more personalized experience to my learning in the workplace? When I can access my Netflix account across devices, why can't I access things that I need across devices? So we have to think about how we make it simple and intuitive and always focused on providing value to the learner and not just the organization.
So I'm a little spoiled, I'm going to admit. I am a very loyal customer of Spotify, and I pull up every week, I pull up the new playlist or the new playlists that Spotify has personalized for me based off of all of my listening history, and I more often than not find some stuff that I really like on there. And that has made me, now that I'm used to that, it's hard for me to want to take the time and go through and cull my library and find things on my own. And as we're all experiencing this type of user interface or user interaction with Netflix or Spotify, or even just the way that we're using a consumer facing website, it can be very frustrating for folks when they're trying to navigate their company's LMS, for example, or they're trying to get through a course that has a bunch of info that is trying to make it one size fits all and it isn't tailored to them. So one of the things that will come out a lot in the data is how personalization is really the new expectation, and that really spans the generations. I also will talk, and Sharon will talk, about augmented reality and virtual reality. And while the true disruption here is not something that's going to be completed here in the next 12 months, it's something that maybe is more in that strategic part of the time horizon. And we do believe that augmented and virtual reality will transform how we train people in a lot of different use cases. And now is the right time to be experimenting.
And finally, the fifth one that we're going to talk about, which might surprise people if they're not really thinking about the whys behind it, is that soft skills have skyrocketed in terms of suddenly being a need. The challenging part connected to that is there's not exactly a quick fix. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth, but that was our fifth key takeaway.
So, like all of our webinars, I encourage you to be ready to participate. This one in particular, we have a couple polls that we're going to launch before we show you the data, so we can kind of compare how the group that's on the call with us today compares to our broader survey. So let me tell you a little bit about the Learning Trends Report. So we've done this for a few years now, and each year we seem to get more responses. You can see the information there on the screen about the number of responses we received, how we compare the data across years, and how we also then will benchmark that data with our anecdotal knowledge of what's happening at our client organizations. So let's take a look here. So a couple things I'll point out really quickly. Healthcare and life science organizations are overrepresented in this data. We have a lot of clients in those related industries, and so that's kind of why that happens. Education and consulting folks are overrepresented because in addition to larger organizations, we have some people in those industries, in those spaces that are interested in this type of information and participate in the survey because of that. We certainly have a majority who are kind of in the instructional designer seat or a similar seat, but we also have a good number of respondents who are at least a management level or higher. So our first question here, I'm going to launch this poll and see what you guys have to say, and Sharon's going to talk a little bit about this. So our first question that we asked people in the survey was, how often do you include learners in your training design process? So I'm going to get that poll launched. I'll give you a little while to respond here.
And we kind of distinguish between design and development for those of you thinking about it. So at this point, we're thinking about, we're launching the project and we're kind of just coming up with the concepts and the designs and possibly some prototypes. Not bad. You can see that we have kind of a range there, but a good number, 38, 40 some percent saying always or usually, with the rest sometimes to never. And let's take a look at why that matters, and let's kind of share what's going on. We asked the same question of our respondents, and you can kind of see how they compared to you. So we had a little bit higher of a percentage that were in the sometimes to never category, and a good number who are saying, yeah, we're doing it, or we're at least doing it frequently. The key is how you're doing it. As design thinking continues to make its way into the instructional design space, so design thinking is a problem-solving approach and process that's been used in other arenas, especially product development, for decades. it's making its way into the instructional design space, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second, we expect the level of target learner involvement to increase and need to increase. So let's talk a bit about why that needs to happen. Design thinking is all about finding that sweet spot. So you start with what are the needs of the organization, for sure. What challenges is the organization having? What problem is it trying to solve, or what opportunity is it trying to leverage? But then you have to think about, okay, so we've decided that we're going to devise a learning solution to this problem. What value will that solution deliver to learners? How will they perceive it? Will they perceive it the same way the organization perceives it? And given all of that, what are the constraints, not just for the organization in terms of how it is willing to deliver a solution, but what about the constraints on the learner in terms of the environment in which they work and how they do their job? Does the learning solution reflect those constraints? Does it factor those in and respect those constraints? Just because a business decides that it wants to push a new product, for example, doesn't mean that salespeople are automatically going to embrace selling it and dive right into the learning of it. If they are already successfully selling other products and those other products can actually make them more money, it's very hard to want to commit to learning and selling a new product. Just because your organization decides that you want to build and promote leadership behaviors doesn't mean that your target learners are going to react with, great, tell me the behaviors, give me the training, I'll get right to it. You have to consider the perspective of those you're designing for and ensure that you're delivering it to them to achieve a value for them as well as to deliver value to the company's bottom line. And that's kind of a new way of thinking for us, honestly. So the way we like to position that is we created what we call our learning journey map. And this is a map we created and rolled out last year. And it's been quite successful for us in helping our clients think differently about the design of any solution, helping them think of the change management that has to go on with the design of the solution. So you can see that the journey starts all the way over here when they have to notice that there is a need to learn something. They have to commit to it. Then they might learn and practice. And then there's repetition and elaboration and reflection and exploration before you get all the way over to sustaining that use over time and getting a result from that. This map has been incredibly helpful to us in generating the ahas as people start to realize that without steps 1, 2, 4, and 5, step 3 on its own doesn't get you to the final destination. So I want to ask you, when you do include target learners in your training design process, which activities are you having them participate in? And this is another poll. So there's a lot of different choices that you can make here, and you can select all of them that you're doing. So a good reference point, interestingly, this 39% on including the target learner in a design meeting, because if we go to the next slide that shows how people responded to us in our survey, you'll see that it's pretty darn close. That 35% in the bright Kelly green, if you will, is how many people are including the learner in the design meeting. And this one's tough because people are always so sensitive to the fact that you don't want to pull the learner away from his or her job to design something. But it's so critical. And what is often happening when people are saying they've got 35% in that design meeting, often what they really have are stand-ins for the learner. So they'll have someone who knows what the job is. Maybe it's somebody's manager, or maybe it's somebody who used to do that job. And they have them in there oftentimes from a content perspective, when what we need to get is that empathic perspective of what are your pain points, what are your motivators, what are you seeing, hearing, feeling as you're doing your job or being asked to do this new thing. The voice of the learner needs to drive to the decisions about what that experience is going to be like for the learner, because they're going to be the ones to tell you whether it's going to provide value or not. They may not be able to tell you the optimal way to learn something, but they can certainly tell you if the user experience is going to be something that engages them or not. So now we ask the same question about development. So once you've kind of locked in on your initial design, and perhaps you're going to start iterating, but you're building. How often do you involve learners when you develop? And we got, again, a mix of responses where there's a subset of 22% that say always. It's just a part of the process, and I applaud those who respond that way. A much bigger chunk said usually or sometimes. It just depends. And then there's a very small subset of less than 20% that say it's only occasional or never. But the key here is how you're involving those learners in the development process. Oftentimes what ends up happening is it's to validate content, and we're seeking to validate the overall experience and the relevance to what they're actually doing or supposed to do in their role. And those are shades of each other. And oftentimes the involvement occurs very late, where companies will pull in somebody to participate in a pilot after things have been developed. And that's great if the pilot is truly a pilot where dramatic revision can still occur. It's not so great if that's happening and the full rollout is planned for 2 weeks post-pilot, because it means that you're really not going to be able to alter the learner experience too much. You're going to go with what you have and make a few tweaks to your content. So you can kind of see from our survey results where people were asking learners to be involved. And for 51%, it was reviewing drafts of content. And what we are really trying to get to is getting them to give input on the learner experience or the user experience as they're going through the tool. So this image on the screen is a prototype we did of an online solution, a mobile solution, and it's a great example here to talk about, because this enabled us to get learner perspective before we actually built out beyond the prototype. We actually went directly to learners, had them interact with the prototype, watched them use it, and got their feedback for relevance to their job and if it would enable them to find what they needed quickly. And it was very interesting because the original client request was for a game-based solution. And when we saw the environment in which people were working and we talked to them, we could see very quickly that games weren't what people wanted and strong gamification wasn't what they wanted. They wanted relevance and the ability to get to the content quickly. So being able to target to the learner requires getting their feedback, and this becomes more critical as online learning is shifting more and more from courses to digital experiences that go beyond a course, such as an app or a portal.
So that kind of brings me to the next question here. And rather than launch this as a poll, because there are way too many options that you might choose, I'd like for you to use the questions area and answer this for us, and we'll kind of share out what we're seeing the majority of folks are saying. So the question that we asked people was, what methods will your organization use in 2019 to deliver training? So maybe if you could, just list out a few of the main ones that you're planning on using in 2019. We've got virtual classrooms, we have instructor-led training, maybe live, job aids, e-learning, classroom. Somebody here said mobile. Somebody puts VR in here. I see workplace and Office 365. Somebody's integrated it into that workflow. A few folks are saying video or simulation based. So by and large, people are saying, and this is what kind of cracks me up, is that by and large, people are saying, well, we're going to use instructor-led training, virtual instructor-led training, and e-learning to deliver content. And that matches up exactly with what we know the reality is and what our data shows. You can see here that year over year, the ones that really dominate are the face-to-face instructor-led training, the online e-learning modules, and also the use of video in one way or the other, and virtual ILT. And so we saw some shifts here, but given the large percentage just overall, I think some of that can just be chalked up to, having some slightly different respondents in the different years. The things that really jumped out at me on this report and the things that I will point out to you, 3 of them are highlighted here. So one is you can see adaptive learning started showing up on this list, and that's very interesting. You can see that it wasn't even on this list in 2017, and then it kind of jumped up there and steadily increased into 2019. The same is true of virtual and augmented reality, and also video practice tools. So platforms like Rehearsal, VRP, or Lego. A lot of folks are starting to use those tools. Chatbots also is on the list here, and we see some organizations saying that they're planning on using those in 2019. And so really the big takeaway here, this is a wonderful graphic put out by Josh Burson, who is a great source for this type of information. The idea is that our training delivery landscape is diversifying. Certainly we have still our core pieces that most organizations use: the learning management system, their classroom training offerings, the online learning, the e-learning modules. But we also have a number of other pieces here. And so it's not so much that an organization is not using some of those more tried and true approaches, it's that they're supplementing them with a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a game-based learning piece here, a VR piece there. I wrote up, our Knowledge Guru product kind of straddles those 2 categories there of being more of an assessment tool / development tool with kind of that micro-learning space. So there's a lot of different tools out there that people are using, and it's just very diverse how that's kind of coming together. So adaptive learning, was probably the hottest topic in our trends report, and a lot of people are interested in adaptive learning. But the reality is that adaptive learning might be on a slower pace than what some people think. Training Magazine published a big piece on emerging technology, and they placed adaptive learning as having limited adoption over the next 5 years. And the reason for this is that adaptive learning, to be truly meaningful in the way that it adapts to the learner, the amount of data that needs to be fed to it is enormous. This is the same principle behind machine learning and how that works. So the adaptive learning tools that are working now and that are out there now are more of a closed system. So our Knowledge Guru Drive app is an example of that, where it adapts to the user based off of their actions, but only within itself. So, and this is a good example, and it applies to other tools where, in this case, the learner indicates their current confidence levels on different learning objectives. They play the mini games, and then based off of their performance, the confidence setting gives them their initial mix of the ordering of what they're going to go through. And then as they play, it adapts to them based off of their actual performance and shows those ratings side by side. So this is a good example where it is adaptive in the sense that it's adapting within itself, but it's not able to adapt based off of the data that's in our HR system or based off of the course I completed in the learning management system. That's kind of that next level of truly, truly adaptive learning. So when you're thinking about adaptive learning and wanting to kind of play with it, it's certainly more attainable, at least right now, to look at tools and offerings that are adapting within themselves, and to kind of set your expectations accordingly, knowing that the amount of data required to really approach that kind of machine learning level generally isn't there when it comes to learning and development. So video is going interactive. Video is going to change a lot over the next couple of years, and that's because 5G networks are coming. We're seeing the battle play out on the advertising, in the advertising that we see here in the United States. And it's going to vastly increase the amount of bandwidth that's available. It's going to make it so much more feasible for high bandwidth content to be used for training. And so something that we're seeing is, for folks that are using video, less people are just creating completely static videos. More people are choosing to make them interactive, where you can make choices that impact the direction that the video progresses. And this really doesn't have to be that high tech. This is a good example of where you can just take technology that currently exists and just apply a new, more innovative design to it to get a better learner experience. So we see a lot of organizations experimenting with this. So chatbots, we're going to talk a little bit about them. The phrase that I like to use is that the best user interface is no user interface. I think that most of us have what I would call user interface fatigue. We're tired of logging into yet another thing. And it's so nice when you can just send a text message to do something instead of having to go to a website and remember your password and what have you. So there is caution, though, in using chatbots because since this is a newer modality for delivering learning, instructional designers are kind of learning as they go. So we recommend including time for good user testing, input from the target learners to ensure that the chatbot that's programmed is mirroring how people are likely to use them. It's also important to draw the distinction between a programmatic chatbot, which is just based off of programming logic. So they don't learn per se, but they can mimic sort of what an artificially intelligent chatbot would do, but they aren't smart in the same way. Versus a chatbot that leverages some level of artificial intelligence. And that's what you see when you're interacting with Alexa or Google Assistant, where those respective companies have invested a lot of time and money in building out their conversational AI platforms so that those bots can carry on semi-intelligent conversations with you. So yes, we have started to include chatbots in more of our learning designs, and we really like, this is a mock-up that we genericized from a design, where instead of the idea is to give people something, a simple assistant, a simple way to assess knowledge, a simple way to ask questions and get pointed in the right direction without necessarily having to log into something, without having to open up the computer and log onto the LMS and hunt around.
Yeah, and Steve, I'll kind of jump in there and say that we're working hard on distilling out the best practices in using chatbots because we are discovering that just because you build it doesn't mean the learner will come. So we are trying to figure out what motivates a learner to use the chatbot and in what context is it going to be most valuable to them. So again, it goes back to optimizing that learner experience and getting their perspective. Because while we on our end as designers can say, well, this would be a great reinforcement tool for our learners, it's only good reinforcement if it gets used. So we have to figure out what best supports push of the chatbot and gets the learner to start pulling information from it.
I think that's a really good point that Sharon made, and I would add to it and say that this is where I think as learning designers are trying to pull from these newer mediums that maybe are more prevalent for marketers, for example, helping to kind of set everyone's expectations as to how usage might deteriorate over time or how only certain subsets of your targets are going to engage, but they're going to engage heavily, and maybe they wouldn't engage in the other offerings. So I think kind of thinking holistically about that and borrowing from other disciplines can help you if you're trying to dive into some of these newer or more emerging delivery methods. So our next question, I'm going to ask you once again to share this out. So this is not necessarily what you're going to be using, or maybe it's what you're going to be using, but you're just going to use it for like one pilot or something. But what are you most excited about as a trend or delivery method for 2019? More virtual training. So VR, more VR. A lot of people are interested in the AR, VR. Design thinking. Video scenarios. Lots of VR, lots of design thinking. Some folks are saying introductory AI. It's a great place to start. So here's what our data showed. And once again, this chart's a little bit overwhelming, so I'm going to highlight just a couple that I want to talk about. So again, we see that strong interest in adaptive learning, definitely an area to start playing. I think this is really interesting when a trend drops heavily. So I think this is really a case of, you see microlearning here. It's still one of the buzzwords that we hear about a lot. But what happens is the initial excitement around something kind of dissipates and it becomes just sort of a normal way of doing things. So I think that a lot of folks have just realized that, yeah, it's more efficient and can be better for the learner if we're not trying to build a really, really difficult new skill, to just go ahead and try to make our content as concise or dribble it out over time. So the micro learning drop there. We also see the big jump here in a couple areas. So chatbots and design thinking popped up, and certainly VR and AR over here on the end. Obviously, very strong interest registered, just like with this group.
So one thing that we are definitely hearing a lot of questions about is augmented reality and virtual reality. And yeah, we definitely think it's a good time to start experimenting with it. We think you should be experimenting with it. We've been ourselves steadily watching it and playing with it for the past few years. We've done some internal experiments with it. Augmented reality has some intriguing use cases. It can seem like the lower barrier to entry because you just need your phone. But its use cases, the ones we've seen that are really optimal uses, seem pretty limited yet. It feels like more of a novelty factor that's drawing attention to it. And you have to be mindful of the hardware challenges that exist. So in the example that we're showing you here, the user is scanning their phone over a display and they're able to see promotions related to different items in that display. And that's novel, but is it really useful when you could go to signage that does that? But if we flip this around and say this is a app for a grocery store worker who is going to stock these areas, and this is where things are supposed to go and how they're supposed to be arranged, then it's suddenly pretty cool, right? We can say they can look at an empty display, they don't know how to set it up, they can put their phone over it, and suddenly they can see how it's supposed to be laid out. So it's a great time to experiment if you have use cases like that. But you have to be mindful that one key limitation right now is the phones themselves. So augmented reality mostly relies on smartphones rather than headsets. Microsoft's got HoloLens out, and the newest release was just talked about at the Mobile Congress last week, and it's all very exciting, but you're not seeing a lot of them implemented yet. So right now you're relying on a phone, and not everybody has the same phone or the same operating system, so what works on one phone may not work across all phones. So you have to think about that, and then you also have to think about how much of a barrier is the phone itself to the experience. How many of us want to hold a phone up for an extended period of time to see something in that manner? So with that said, and those caveats, we're doing small scale AR experiments internally. And if you have a big dollar budget, you can get some really impressive displays, something that will definitely capture your learner's attention. Being able to conjure up a map overlay, being able to do an animation that lets you see inside your body, or being able to get just-in-time directions. There's also a lot of low-cost entry points to virtual reality, and we're showing you a couple of them here. This is something that we did, and we just use Oculus headsets and 360 immersive video with hot spots identified, and we kind of did a safety simulation here where you were spotting the safety errors, and it kind of allows you to have that directional overlay as you go, and it can be an immersive experience. Another really cool use case for VR is that creating a virtual space for live actors to come into and engage in a real-time conversation. There are, if you are at an enterprise level and you have an enterprise-wide need for something, there are companies out there that are doing some amazing work. One that I would call out is Striver. Strive VR is how it's spelled. They've done some really cool stuff for Verizon on handling an active shooter in a store. And that's an example where it's a very high risk situation and you are wanting your employees to be able to respond. You actually want to trigger the emotion of fear that you might have and get them to execute those skills when they're experiencing the real emotions that they might feel. That's a very expensive solution, but so is the risk is also very high. So we're looking at the lower entry points because we think that there's the big wins on those, but we're also watching the other use cases. Steve pointed out that microlearning has gone down as a trend in 2019, and I think it's that the term is going down. People are a bit tired of it. The concept is sound instructionally, and it's been around for a very, very long time. The idea of breaking content into small, just-in-time pieces. And with responsive mobile design, it enables a lot. It enables us to push out things that are designed to meet the learner where he or she is. In this example, we've genericized a mobile app that is for healthcare providers, for physicians, and it gives them information that they might want, most current learning on a disease state. It gives them patient perspectives. It gives them things to think about as they're screening patients for this. And it presents it in a way that's going to allow them to consume it in a variety of situations. So they have podcasts that they can listen to during drive time or while they're exercising. They have videos they could view. They have infographics they could skim, or they have articles that they could read. It's all clustered together in 14 little micro lessons that will only take them a few minutes at a time to consume, and it allows them to engage with the content in some different ways. Another example is a solution that we are creating for a company that manufactures home dialysis equipment. So we have two pathways here, one for the patient or care partner and one for the nurse educator. And this is really powerful because patients learn home dialysis in a center, and then they have to go home and they have to practice dialyzing on their own as they get a little bit more proficient. So this app actually allows the nurse educator to customize the training path to the specific constraints of the patient, and the patient has the ability to go back and cover information covered in the session, and also get just-in-time information on troubleshooting and setup, as you can kind of see on the two screens on the right. So it's an awesome example of micro-learning, although we wouldn't call it that way anymore. We would just say it's just-in-time support. And then finally, this is an example of a field-based solution that is designed primarily for sales reps who go and they have an amazing experience at a sales meeting or a national training conference or event as a product is launched, and they are consuming large quantities of information on a new product. They go out into the field and then they're scratching their head thinking, you know, it seemed so clear when I was in that live event, and now I'm struggling to recall. So this allows them to recall the information they've forgotten and embed it into long-term memory so that they can incorporate it into their selling process. All designed in very small bits, and as Steve pointed out, in an adaptive format that's going to kind of pay attention to how they're performing and give them more or less content based on how well they're doing.
So that brings us to our next question here. So now thinking beyond 2019, so you are not constrained to what you think is something you could implement or even pilot this year, but just thinking into the future, please use the questions window to share with us what emerging trends you are most excited about beyond 2019. VR, AR, AI, VR and AR, AI. Everybody loves that VR. Adaptive learning. Okay, everybody's pretty much saying the same things here. We've got a lot of VR, some artificial intelligence, and a few votes for adaptive learning or chatbots. Some folks said gamification, but I'd argue that that's already here and ready for you, so you can get started on that anytime. So what are you excited about beyond 2019? Here were our survey results. So we do see, there's a lot of people, regardless of the term and its popularity, there's still a lot of interest in microlearning, and some folks are excited about it just going into the future trying to explore that more. Adaptive learning is high on the list. Virtual and augmented, interestingly enough, were a little bit lower on this chart, although we saw a lot of people using that as their answer for the current year. So adaptive learning leads the way here too. It's been kind of leading the way throughout this segment. And I think that one of the things that will make adaptive learning more possible for folks will be as the Experience API or XAPI gets implemented by more organizations. Learning experience design is something that is really coming into focus, and design thinking relates to this. And really, the reason for that, I think, is that as more people are wanting to design consumer grade learning experiences, it just takes a little bit more than what people are used to if they're used to the more traditional instructional design processes to make something that is going to be usable and delightful to the end user. And so as we get these more advanced and robust learning solution options, it by its very nature demands some more evolved design processes. And so that showed up a lot on our survey, and that's something that we've been really working on a lot internally as we've been rolling out different types of learning solutions. So what knowledge or skills do your target learners need to be successful? We've only got a few minutes left, so we're gonna cut the chats here. I'm just gonna share the results. So we've done this, asked this questions a few different ways over the years, and the big thing that we really noticed here was the jump in soft skills. And Sharon had some thoughts that she was going to share on the topic of soft skills.
So yeah, and actually, Steve, if you just roll forward, I'll kind of jump right in. Maybe that goes a lot farther. Yeah, the demand for soft skills is quote unquote suddenly on the rise. It's a fairly shocking shift for us, actually, if you see it, although when you know the data, you'll understand that it's been in the works for a while. It's one of the most significant shifts that we've measured, however, and the big reason for that is because there are a lot of baby boomers, the youngest of which are now 55. So that's the youngest edge of the baby boomers, and they comprise now only 22% of the workforce. The millennials are at 50%. They're the dominant generation in the workforce. However, that baby boomer generation is a huge part of our management ranks. 48% of our management, or almost half of managers, are eligible for retirement because baby boomers are our managers and our senior leaders. So that rapid turn in management leaves us with a big hole to fill, and it's compounded because there's not enough skilled people in general to fill it. No people, period. Right now we have 7.3 million job openings in this country. It's the highest it's been in 20 years, and since the Department of Labor has been tracking the statistic, and we have an unemployment rate that's well below the consideration of full employment. So we have this demand for soft skills. The other compounding factor that I think people are eyeballing is the advance of artificial intelligence. And remember, I told you that I saw that more on the 10-year horizon than I do in the next 2 to 5 years. But AI is going to start phasing out fact-based or repetitive jobs. So there's a certain tier of jobs that aren't going to be needed, and other jobs that are going to be much more highly in demand, such as those that require high EQ or strong communication skills or leadership skills. So that's driving demand for soft skills, and there is no magic wand we can wave to suddenly say now we have everybody upskilled on soft skills.
Absolutely. So the last few questions here. What challenges do your learners face that makes it difficult for them to build the knowledge and skills they need to be successful? And as you can see, there was a pretty good consensus here that time is the issue, whether it's a perceived lack of time, lack of desire to make the time, or just absolutely just these people are so busy and there's these small windows what they have to learn what they need to learn. ATD has really good data on this, and their State of the Industry report consistently tells us that people have around 34 hours a year dedicated to training and skill development. The challenge is that people need to learn more things than they may be used to be successful in today's jobs, but the amount of time that they have to do that is still the same. So that is why it is more important than ever to be giving people that exact learning experience that they personally need in the moment of need, enabling that kind of learning in the flow of work besides just your formal training courses and experiences. And then we asked the question, what challenges do you, the trainer or the learning leader, face when you're trying to help learners build the knowledge and skills? And time shows up here again. Of course, we all feel like we don't have enough time to do what we feel like we really need to do to be successful or to optimize something the way we might want to. One that I want to highlight here that really surprised me in how high it jumped was people saying that the lack of instructional design skills or knowledge, either within themselves or on their teams, to create the type of experiences that would be optimal. And we hear that a lot from people where they know what would be optimal. They're interested in all these emerging trends and delivery methods, but they are maybe a more traditional instructional designer, or maybe they haven't even had that training and they are being asked to develop training, and they don't have the ability to do that in the way that they would like to be doing it. So that's an area that has grown on this survey over time. And so, yeah, just the point that I just made there, where a lot of times you've got somebody who maybe doesn't have that formal background or skill in instructional design, or maybe the type of solution that they're being asked to design requires different things like game design skill or design thinking or user experience design, things like that are really kind of beyond the traditional realm that an instructional designer plays. And so then finally here, if you can improve one thing about learning and development at your organization in 2019, what would it be? And here, so people want to have better training designs and methods, and that has not changed. But the thing that I highlighted here was this massive jump, but from the previous year, for people who wanted to have better needs analysis. And really, if you read the responses, it's they want to have better needs analysis, better alignment with the real business and operational requirements, and getting their training to be truly driving an outcome. So, and that's why we really feel, and in our own work and when we're just sharing out our perspective with the broader industry, really pushing people, and for you, pushing your own stakeholders to make sure that the business needs are front and center, the learner needs are considered as well, but that you're really making sure that your training designs are connected to those operational goals so that they're driving outcomes for you. So we've got just a couple minutes. We'll open it up for questions. While we do that, I wanted to share, some of you were aware, some of you may have attended last year's XLearn conference in Indianapolis. We are doing it again this year. We've added a pre-conference workshop that's a full-day design thinking workshop led by Sharon, and registration actually opened today for XLearn. So the link is on the screen. We'll send that out to you as well if you're interested in checking out the conference. We have some great speakers coming in. We have Dr. Carl Kopp and Melissa Daimler, the former CLO of Twitter, who are going to be keynoting with us. So it's going to be a great day of learning, and that pre-conference workshop, it's going to be awesome as well. So with that said, Sharon, were there any questions that you saw coming through that you wanted to address for the whole group?
It looks like they fell so far in a range, but I will say somebody commented that they were trying to do a soft skills training workshop for millennials, and then it felt very flat. Said she didn't need soft skills, and I strongly encouraged them to think about reframing that as leadership skills. My experience, I facilitate a program at Salesforce for their Women's Leaders program, and I see younger individuals very hungry to deepen their leadership toolbox and their leadership skills toolbox. So I think it's a matter of how we frame that, as opposed to a perception that people don't want it or need it.
Here we have one. Can user testing be used for the needs analysis?
It's an interesting question that you're asking that. I don't, yes. So short answer, yes. If you do that with very early prototypes, that's kind of the slide that we showed you back midpoint in our deck of a solution that we developed for the phone. That's kind of what we did, was validate what users wanted and didn't want by virtue of showing them a prototype and letting them talk about it. We will also do iterative user testing as we push out new features or create new features, which will allow us to get feedback from them on the value that it's providing them and helping them learn something, the engagement they are experiencing as they go through it, and the clarity of the experience for them. Do they understand what they're being asked to do? So that kind of blends testing and analysis. Is it providing value to me goes to that. And I am seeing someone ask if we see similar trends for Canada, or are we behind U.S. companies? I'm not sure I can speak to Canada. So Steve, do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, and we don't break our data down by geographic area. I'll tell you that most of our audience and respondents do come from the United States, and so if we were to break it down, it would be too small of a minority from the different other countries to be a meaningful data set. But I mean, in my experience, there's some pretty innovative companies that are operating in Canada or are based in Canada. So I wouldn't necessarily assume that you're years behind the US, and in some ways you might be years ahead of the US. All right, well, our email addresses are there on the screen if you have any other questions, and we'll be sending out the recording. And I certainly hope to see some of you at our XLearn conference in September. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.